What if everything you thought you knew about Lil Buck's case was only half the story? What if the headlines lied? The streets stayed silent and the real truth was buried on purpose? Because this isn't just another rapper caught in the system, this is a chain reaction, one decision triggering another, leading straight to Ksoo's shocking downfall. Lil Buck's name appears in court documents, but the paperwork doesn't explain the pressure, the alliances, or the moment. When loyalty stopped meaning anything, behind closed doors, moves were made that changed the direction of this case forever, and most people never saw it coming. And then there's Ksoo, once feared, once untouchable, a name that rang loud in the streets. Now, everything that protected him started collapsing. One witness, one charge, one mistake at a time. Fans keep asking, was Lil Buck set up? Or sacrificed? Did Ksoo fall because of the system? Or because the streets turned cold? Tonight, we're breaking down the connections nobody wants to talk about. The silent moments that mattered more than gunshots, and the evidence that flipped this entire narrative upside down. These aren't internet rumors. This isn't clout talk. This is the missing context, the unspoken moves, and the truth behind how Lil Buck's case and Ksoo's downfall became permanently linked by the end of this video. You won't just understand what happened, you'll understand why it was inevitable. Before the courtrooms, before the indictments, before the headlines started screaming names, there was a timeline nobody wanted to slow down and examine. Lil Buck didn't wake up one day and suddenly became a headline. His case didn't explode out of nowhere. It was built brick by brick through choices, associations, pressure, and moments where silence spoke louder than words. To understand Lil Buck's situation, you have to rewind past the viral clips and court summaries and look at how the streets and the system quietly overlap. Lil Buck was known in his circle as someone moving carefully, not flashy, not loud, but present. That matters, because in cases like this, presence alone can be interpreted as participation. Prosecutors don't just chase actions, they chase patterns. Who was around, who benefited, who stayed quiet when questions were asked. And that's where things start getting uncomfortable according to public records and ongoing discussions surrounding the case. Lil Buck's name surfaced not because of a single smoking gun moment, but because of connections that refused to disappear. Texts, timelines, associations that, on their own, might mean nothing but together begin to paint a picture. The state is eager to sell. This is how cases are really built. Not with one explosive revelation, but with a slow tightening of the net. What fans don't always realize is that when the system decides to move, it doesn't start at the top. It starts at the edges, people with fewer resources, people who can be pressured, people who can be positioned as either witnesses or examples. And Lil Buck found himself standing exactly in that danger zone. Behind the scenes, investigators were reportedly piecing together narratives that linked multiple names into one storyline. Not all of those names were equal in power, and that imbalance is critical. When pressure comes down, someone always absorbs it first. That's where speculation begins to grow. Was Lil Buck targeted because of what he did or because of who he knew? That question keeps resurfacing, especially when you look at how quickly the narrative around him hardened. Social media moved faster than facts. Commentary turned into conclusions. Suddenly, Lil Buck wasn't just a person facing charges. He became a symbol, a placeholder for a larger story that hadn't fully surfaced yet. Meanwhile, the streets were watching quietly, because when someone's name enters the legal system, loyalty changes. Phones stop ringing, doors stop opening, and people who once stood close start calculating distance. This is the moment when survival instincts kick in and the code everyone talks about gets tested for real. Sources and observers close to the situation suggest that Lil Buck was facing pressure from multiple directions at once. Legal pressure from the state, social pressure from public opinion, and internal pressure from knowing that every move could affect someone else higher up the chain. And that's where the silence becomes dangerous. Silence can be interpreted as strength or as guilt. Silence can protect or isolate. And in Lil Buck's case, silence may have done both. As the case progressed, pieces of information started leaking. Not enough to give clarity, but just enough to fuel suspicion. Selective details reached the public, while other crucial contexts stayed locked behind legal strategy. That imbalance shaped how fans and commentators saw Lil Buck, not as someone navigating a complex legal minefield, but as someone already decided by the court of public opinion. But here's what most people miss. Cases like this aren't about truth alone, they're about leverage. Prosecutors build leverage, defendants calculate risk, and every name involved becomes a potential bargaining chip. Lil Buck's position was especially fragile because of timing. His situation unfolded while another name, far bigger, far louder, was already under intense scrutiny. That name was Ksoo. And whether people admit it or not, the shadow of Ksoo's situation loomed over every decision being made. At this stage, Lil Buck's case wasn't just about him anymore. It became about what his case could unlock. Could it strengthen a larger narrative? Could it apply pressure elsewhere? Could it help complete a picture the state was already assembling? These are the questions that don't show up in headlines, but they guide everything behind closed doors. And for Lil Buck, that meant walking a tightrope where every option carried consequences. Fight too hard and risk being framed as uncooperative. Say too much and risk being seen as the weak link. Stay quiet and let others control the story. There was no clean exit. Fans online debated endlessly, some defending him, others condemning him without realizing that the real battle wasn't happening on social media, it was happening in legal strategy sessions, in quiet conversations, and in moments where decisions had to be made without guarantees. And while Lil Buck's situation tightened, something else was happening in parallel. The structure that once protected certain figures began to crack. Names that once felt untouchable started appearing in uncomfortable places. Old assumptions stopped holding weight. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, the foundation under Ksoo began to weaken. That's not a coincidence. It's cause and effect because Lil Buck's case didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a larger unraveling, one that would soon expose just how fragile power becomes when tension shifts from the streets to the courtroom, and this is only the beginning. We'll break down how Ksoo's position collapsed piece by piece, how the same system that once struggled to touch him suddenly gained momentum, and why Lil Buck's case may have played a far bigger role than anyone wants to admit, because once the dominoes start falling, they don't stop on their own. By the time Lil Buck's case started tightening, the atmosphere around Ksoo had already changed, even if most people didn't notice it yet. From the outside, things still looked solid. The reputation was intact. The name still carried weight. But behind the scenes, the protections that once kept distance between Ksoo and serious consequences were wearing thin. This is how downfalls really begin, not with a single dramatic arrest, but with small fractures that spread quietly. Until the entire structure gives way, Ksoo's rise was built on presence and perception. In environments like this, perception is currency. Being seen as untouchable can be just as powerful as actually being protected. For a long time, that perception worked in his favor. People assumed lines couldn't be crossed, that evidence couldn't stick, that witnesses wouldn't talk, but assumptions don't survive pressure. As investigations expanded, attention shifted from isolated incidents to patterns, and patterns are dangerous. They invite comparison. They encourage timelines. They allow prosecutors to connect dots instead of chasing moments. This is where the narrative changes from what happened to what keeps happening. And once that door opens, everything inside gets examined. Observers close to the situation point out that Ksoo's downfall didn't start with one charge. It started when momentum shifted. Investigators reportedly gained traction through smaller, less visible developments. Cooperation rumors, corroborating details, overlapping stories that refused to stay separate. Momentum is the one thing reputation can't stop. At the same time, social media began doing what it always does, amplifying fragments without context. Clips circulated, old lyrics were reanalyzed, past interviews were replayed with new assumptions attached. While none of this proves anything in a courtroom, it reshapes public perception, and perception matters when pressure is being applied. That pressure doesn't just come from the state, it comes from everyone involved. As scrutiny increased, the network around Ksoo started adjusting. People who once spoke freely became cautious. Some distanced themselves entirely. Others stayed visible, but said less. This isn't betrayal, it's survival. When the temperature rises, everyone looks for shade, and that's when isolation begins. Isolation is one of the most underestimated forces in cases like this. When someone loses access, loses communication, loses the ability to control the narrative, they become vulnerable in ways that money or reputation can't fix. Information starts moving without them. Decisions get made around them, not with them. Around them, not with them. This is where Lil Buck's case becomes impossible to separate from Ksoo's situation. Because as pressure increased on Ksoo, leverage became valuable. Anything that could strengthen or support a broader narrative gained importance. Smaller cases weren't small anymore. They became potential keys, potential bridges, potential pressure points. That doesn't mean deals were made or lines were crossed, but it does mean that context changed. Suddenly, individual cases mattered not just for their outcomes, but for how they fit into something bigger, and the system thrives on that. Ksoo's downfall accelerated when the illusion of control faded. Once the idea of untouchability cracks, it invites scrutiny from every direction. Law enforcement looks harder, the media digs deeper, Associates reassess their positions. Silence becomes suspicious instead of strategic. Every move becomes reactive. At this stage, narratives begin to compete. One side pushes the image of inevitability, that consequences are always coming. The other pushes resistance, that nothing is proven, that perception is being weaponized. The truth usually lives somewhere in between, shaped by evidence, strategy, and timing. Timing is everything, and the timing couldn't have been worse. With multiple threads converging, Ksoo found himself facing not just allegations but a collapsing buffer. The space that once existed between his name and direct accountability narrowed. The system didn't need a dramatic breakthrough anymore. It needed patience. That patience paid off. As developments continued, each update reinforced the same idea. This wasn't about a single incident or a sudden mistake. This was about accumulation. When enough pieces stack up, resistance becomes expensive, legally, emotionally, and strategically. Meanwhile, fans struggled to reconcile the image they believed in with the reality unfolding. Loyalty clashed with logic. Support battled skepticism. The streets debated while the courtroom prepared. And here's the uncomfortable part most people avoid. Downfalls like this aren't caused by one enemy or one informant or one bad decision. They're caused by systems colliding, street systems and legal systems operating by completely different rules. What protects you in one can destroy you in the other. Ksoo's downfall illustrates that perfectly. The same visibility that once built his reputation made it impossible to move quietly when attention turned hostile. The same connections that once felt like strength became points of exposure. The same silence that once suggested confidence started looking like avoidance. And as that shift happened, the outcome stopped feeling sudden. It started feeling inevitable, which brings us back to Little Buck by this point. It was clear that his case and Ksoo's situation weren't just overlapping, they were interconnected by consequence, if not by action. Each development in one case influenced perception in the other. Each rumor fueled speculation. Each legal move carried weight beyond the courtroom. This is how narratives lock together, and once they do, separating them becomes nearly impossible in the public eye. Lil Buck's case became a preview. Ksoo's downfall became confirmation. Whether that perception is fair or not is something only the legal process can decide. But perception drives pressure, and pressure shapes outcomes. We'll break down what all of this means going forward. The long-term consequences, the strategic crossroads both cases now face, and why the final chapter won't just determine guilt or innocence, it will redefine how power, loyalty, and survival are viewed moving forward. Because when the system finally finishes tightening its grip, everyone connected feels it. By the time everything reached this stage, the outcome stopped being about shock value and started being about consequences. Not just legal consequences, but cultural ones. Because when cases like Lil Buck's and Ksoo's reach the endgame, they don't just decide futures in a courtroom. They rewrite narratives, expose illusions, and force everyone watching to confront uncomfortable truths. This is where the noise fades. No more rumors, no more speculation, just reality closing in. For Lil Buck, the final chapter isn't defined by one moment, it's defined by positioning. Where he stands now is the result of every move made earlier. What was said, what wasn't said, who stayed close, and who disappeared when pressure peaked. His case illustrates a harsh truth about the system. Sometimes it doesn't matter how loud your innocence is if the narrative around you grows louder. By this stage, Lil Buck isn't just fighting charges, he's fighting interpretation. Prosecutors interpret silence. The public interprets association. Social media interprets absence as guilt. And once those interpretations harden, reversing them becomes nearly impossible. This is the real weight. Defendants carry not just evidence, but expectation. Expectation that someone will break. Expectation that someone will talk. Expectation that the system will get what it wants. And when those expectations aren't met, pressure increases little. Buck's position highlights how smaller figures often become pressure valves in larger investigations. That doesn't automatically mean injustice, but it does mean imbalance. Resources aren't equal, attention isn't equal, and outcomes are rarely shaped in a vacuum. What makes his situation especially tragic is how limited the options become. At this point, every choice carries risk. Cooperation brings one kind of fallout. Resistance brings another. Even winning legally doesn't erase the stigma once a name has circulated long enough. This is the part fans don't talk about. Winning a case doesn't always mean getting your life back. Meanwhile, Ksoo's situation represents the other side of the spectrum. What happens when power meets persistence? His downfall isn't sudden anymore. It's methodical, structured, calculated. The system didn't rush, it waited. And waiting is often the most dangerous move. By the final phase, the protections that once mattered no longer function. Reputation doesn't intimidate paperwork. Street credibility doesn't weaken timelines. Loyalty doesn't erase corroboration. The legal process strips everything down to what can be proven, supported, and argued, not what's believed. This is where untouchable becomes reachable. KSU's case now reflects a familiar pattern. Once the system gains confidence, it rarely loosens its grip. Every filing reinforces momentum. Every appearance reinforces seriousness. Every delay reinforces inevitability. The question stops being if something will happen and becomes how far it will go, and that's the part that changes everything. Because when a high-profile figure reaches this stage, the impact goes far beyond them. It sends signals to the streets, to the industry, to anyone watching how power collapses once scrutiny becomes sustained. The illusion breaks. People start realizing that insulation isn't immunity, that silence isn't invisibility. Those systems don't need chaos to win, they need time. This is where both cases converge in meaning. Lil Buck's case shows how quickly someone can become trapped between narratives. KSU's downfall shows how slowly power can erode before finally giving way. Together, they expose the same truth from different angles. The system doesn't move emotionally, it moves strategically, and strategy doesn't care about legacy. As the final outcomes approach, what remains isn't just judgment, it's reflection. Fans are forced to question the stories they accepted without evidence. The streets are forced to reassess what protection actually looks like. And the culture is forced to confront how quickly it consumes people once their names trend for the wrong reasons. This isn't about choosing sides, it's about understanding patterns. Patterns of pressure, patterns of collapse, patterns of sacrifice. Because cases like these don't happen in isolation, they happen in cycles. And unless those cycles are understood, they repeat with new names, new faces, and the same consequences for Little Buck. The future remains uncertain, but the lesson is already written. Proximity matters, timing matters. And once a narrative locks in, escaping it takes more than truth. It takes leverage. For Ksoo, the lesson is even harsher. Dominance without discretion invites scrutiny. Visibility without insulation invites collapse. And once the system decides it has enough, resistance becomes symbolic rather than strategic. This is the endgame most people never prepare for. Not the arrest, not the headlines, but the long stretch, where outcomes form quietly while the world argues loudly. By the time the final decisions are made, the shock will be gone. What remains will be acceptance, and the realization that what felt sudden was actually years in the making. So when people ask, how did it end like this? The real answer is, it didn't end like this. It built like this, piece by piece, silence by silence, decision by decision. And once the final verdicts are in, they won't just close cases, they'll close chapters on how power, loyalty, and consequence are understood moving forward. Because in the end, the truth isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's inevitable. If you've made it this far, understand this. You're not just watching a story, you're witnessing a pattern. A pattern the streets know too well, but rarely slow down enough to analyze. Lil Buck's case and KSU's downfall aren't just about two names. They're about how quickly loyalty fades, how narratives form, and how the system moves when the spotlight locks in. This is why conversations like this matter, because if we don't break these situations down beyond headlines and rumors, the same cycle keeps repeating. New faces, same endings, and the truth gets buried under viral clips and half-informed opinions. So now it's on you.